Sometimes the smallest decisions we make carry the heaviest consequences. A single choice made in innocence can change not just one life, but an entire community forever. In the Wyoming wilderness, a mountain man named Ezra Blackwood found an old cottonwood tree leaking water onto the dry ground. It seemed like nature's gift during a hard summer drought. He decided to cut it down for firewood. What happened next stopped everyone in the nearby town cold. The water didn't stop flowing. It became something else entirely, something no one could explain. What was hidden inside that ancient tree that held such power over the land and its people? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ezra Blackwood had been living alone in the Wyoming mountains for 12 years. At 58, his face carried the deep lines of a man who'd spent more time squinting at horizons than looking in mirrors. His hands were scarred from a lifetime of work, first as a logger in his younger days, and then as a solitary mountain man who knew every ridge and valley for 30 miles in any direction. His cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, about an hour's walk from the nearest road. The structure was simple but solid, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and milled himself. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch wrapped around the front where he'd sit most evenings, watching the light change across the mountains. He woke each morning before dawn. The routine never changed. Stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil, step outside to read the weather. He could tell more from the wind and sky than any newspaper could tell him about the world. After coffee, he'd check his traps, tend to his small garden, chop wood or hunt depending on the season and his needs. Ezra had learned to live with silence. Not the uncomfortable silence that makes some people nervous, but the deep quiet of the wilderness where every sound means something. The crack of a branch told him if it was deer or elk. The call of a hawk indicated the time of day. The rustle of leaves revealed which way the wind was shifting. This was his language now, more fluent than the English he spoke on his monthly trips to town. Those trips took him to Timber Ridge, a frontier town that had seen better days, but held on with the stubbornness of its 347 residents. The town consisted of a main street with a general store, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and the sheriff's office. Doc Holloway kept his practice in a house at the edge of town, marked by a hand-painted sign that swung in the wind. The people of Timber Ridge knew Ezra as a fair man who kept his word. He'd trade furs and game meat for supplies, always paid his debts and never caused trouble. But they also knew not to pry into his business or ask too many questions about why a skilled logger had abandoned that trade to live alone on a mountain. Sheriff Martha Crane was one of the few people Ezra considered close to a friend, though they rarely spoke beyond necessities. She was 62, had been sheriff for 18 years, and had earned the respect of every man in town through simple competence and an unwavering sense of fairness. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident 20 years back and never remarried. Like Ezra, she understood that some people are better suited to solitude than others. Doc Holloway was another familiar face. He'd been practicing medicine in Timber Ridge for 30 years, had delivered half the children in town, and buried a good portion of their grandparents. He was a thoughtful man, with gentle hands and a sharp mind, educated back east, but content in this remote corner of Wyoming. He'd treated Ezra more than once for various injuries, a gash from a mishandled axe, a fever that nearly killed him one winter, a broken finger from a fall. Then there was Timothy Walsh, the blacksmith's apprentice. He was barely 22, eager and curious, in the way young people are before life teaches them caution. Timothy had a habit of asking questions, of wanting to know the why behind things, not just the how. Most folks found it endearing. Ezra found it exhausting, but he had a soft spot for the boy nonetheless. These were the people who formed the edges of Ezra's world. He didn't need more than that. He'd had more once. A wife, a home in town, friends who'd gather for Sunday dinners and summer picnics. But that was before Sarah died. before grief had hollowed him out and sent him running to the mountains, where the silence couldn't judge him for surviving when she hadn't. Sarah had been gone for 12 years. The pain had dulled from a sharp blade to a constant ache, something he carried like old men carry their wounds from long-ago wars. He didn't talk about her, not even to himself most days. But sometimes, in the evenings, when the light hit the mountains just right, he'd remember the way she laughed, and the ache would sharpen again. This particular summer had been brutal. The drought started in May and showed no signs of breaking. The streams ran low, the grass turned brown early, and the forest became a tinderbox, waiting for a careless spark. Ezra had seen droughts before, but this one felt different. The animals sensed it too. They moved differently, acted skittish, appeared in places they normally avoided. It was during one of his walks through the forest, checking on water sources, that Ezra first noticed the tree. He'd passed it 1,000 times over the years. An ancient cottonwood that stood alone in a small clearing about 2 miles from his cabin. The tree was massive, easily 100 feet tall, with a trunk so wide it would take 3 men with arms outstretched to circle it. But on that day in late June, something was different. Water was seeping from the bark about 5 feet up the trunk, running down in steady rivulets to pool on the ground below. At first, he thought perhaps the tree's roots had tapped into an underground spring, and the pressure was forcing water up through some crack or hollow in the wood. Such things happened, though he'd never seen it personally. He knelt and touched the water. It was cold, clean, tasted pure. The ground around the tree had turned to mud, the only wet earth he'd seen in weeks. He stood there for a long while, studying the tree, trying to understand what he was seeing. The bark looked healthy, no signs of disease or insect damage. The leaves were full and green. By all appearances, the tree was thriving. Over the next 3 weeks, Ezra returned to the cottonwood every few days. The water never stopped flowing. If anything, it increased slightly. The puddle became a small pond, maybe 10 feet across. Animals came to drink. Deer, elk, even a mountain lion he spotted one evening. The tree was providing for them during the drought, like a gift from the earth itself. But the dreams started around the same time. Ezra would find himself standing in the clearing, but the forest looked different, older somehow. The tree was there but younger, and there were others like it scattered across the landscape. People moved among them, tending to them with careful hands. They spoke in a language he didn't recognize, but their actions were clear. They were protecting the trees, honoring them in some way. He'd wake from these dreams with a strange feeling he couldn't name. Not quite unease, but something close to it. A sense that he was seeing something important, something he was meant to understand but didn't. The knife he carried on his belt had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. The handle was worn smooth from generations of hands, the blade kept sharp through constant care. It was more than a tool. It was a connection to the men who'd come before him, to the values they'd held about hard work, self-reliance, and respecting the land that provided for you. That knife had skinned countless animals, carved wood for his cabin, cut rope and leather and everything else a man needed to survive in the wilderness. It had been with him the day Sarah died, though it couldn't cut away grief. It had been with him every day since, a reminder that some things endure even when others don't. By mid-July, Ezra had made his decision. Winter would come eventually, and he needed firewood. The cottonwood was already giving water to the forest. It could give him warmth as well. He told himself it was practical, sensible. The tree was old. It might fall in a storm anyway. Better to harvest it now while it could be useful. He didn't examine too closely why he felt the need to justify the decision to himself. He didn't think about the dreams or the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. He thought only about winter, about survival, about the simple arithmetic of a man alone who needed to prepare for cold months ahead. So on a clear morning in late July, Ezra Blackwood took his grandfather's silver logging axe, walked to the ancient cottonwood tree that wept water onto the dry earth, and prepared to cut it down. He had no way of knowing that this single choice would change everything, not just for him, but for every person in Timber Ridge, and perhaps far beyond. The silver axe had belonged to Ezra's grandfather, a man who'd logged the forests of Oregon before moving east to Wyoming in search of new timber. The handle was made of hickory, worn smooth by decades of use, and the head was forged steel that held an edge better than any modern tool Ezra had ever owned. His grandfather had used it to clear land, build homes, and feed his family. It represented an era when men worked with their hands and measured their worth by what they could provide. Ezra hefted the axe, feeling its familiar weight. The morning was still cool, though the sun promised another scorching day. He approached the cottonwood with the practiced eye of a man who'd felled hundreds of trees in his younger years. The trunk was enormous, but he knew the technique. Find the right angle, create a proper notch, work steadily, and let the tool do most of the work. He studied the tree one last time before beginning. The bark was deeply furrowed, gray-brown and textured like the skin of some ancient creature. The water still seeped from that spot 5 feet up, running down in clear streams. The leaves rustled softly overhead, though there was barely any wind. For a moment Ezra had the strange thought that the tree was aware of him, watching, waiting. He shook off the notion and positioned himself. The first swing bit deep into the wood with a solid thunk that echoed across the clearing. He worked the axe free and swung again. The third strike released a sudden gush of water that splashed across his boots. More than before, much more. It poured from the cut like he'd struck a pressurized pipe. Ezra stepped back, surprised. The water flow increased with each strike, far more than should be possible from any natural source. But he'd committed now, and the tree needed to be felled safely. He continued working, creating the notch on the side he wanted the tree to fall. With each swing, more water poured out, pooling around his feet, soaking into the dry earth. The sound of the axe changed. Instead of the clean thunk of steel-biting wood, it began to resonate, a deep, almost musical tone that vibrated through the handle and up his arms. The tree itself seemed to hum with each impact, as if the wood were hollow and acting as some kind of resonating chamber. Ezra had logged for 20 years before Sarah's death. He'd cut pine and fir, oak and ash, birch and maple. He'd never heard a tree make a sound like this. The humming grew louder, deeper, until he could feel it in his chest, in his bones. The water flowing from the cuts began to shimmer strangely in the morning light. He moved to the opposite side to make the back cut that would bring the tree down. The notch was perfect, angled exactly right. 3 more strong swings and the tree would go. He raised the axe high and brought it down with all his strength. The blade bit deep and the tree shuddered. The humming became a groan, a sound like nothing Ezra had ever heard. Wood and water and something else, something that made the hair on his neck stand up. He struck again. The tree leaned, the fibers beginning to tear. One more strike. The axe fell for the final time. The cottonwood groaned one last time and began its descent, falling exactly where Ezra had intended, crashing through smaller trees and hitting the ground with an impact he felt through his boots. Birds scattered from the surrounding forest. Dust and leaves filled the air, and then silence. Ezra stood breathing hard, axe in hand, watching the fallen giant. The water that had been flowing from the trunk now poured from the stump, more than should be physically possible. It gushed out like a broken dam, spreading across the clearing in all directions, but something was wrong. The water looked different. As it spread, it caught the sunlight and seemed to crystallize, taking on a strange, glittering quality. Not ice, the day was already warm, but something else. The liquid became almost solid as it touched the dry earth, creating a spreading layer of translucent, crystalline substance that looked like glass but moved like water. Ezra knelt and reached toward it, then pulled his hand back. Every instinct told him not to touch it. He watched as the substance spread outward in a slow but steady wave, covering the ground, climbing up the smaller trees at the edge of the clearing, coating everything it touched in a thin, shimmering layer. The air itself changed. It grew heavy, thick, harder to breathe. The temperature dropped suddenly, going from warm to cold in the space of a few heartbeats. Ezra's breath came out in visible puffs. The humming that had come from the tree while he cut it now seemed to come from everywhere. From the substance itself, a low vibration, that made his teeth ache. He stepped backward, away from the spreading crystalline wave. It moved slowly enough that he could easily stay ahead of it, but it showed no signs of stopping. It flowed around the fallen tree, over the stump, spreading in all directions like some living thing seeking to cover every inch of ground. Ezra's mind raced. This wasn't natural. This wasn't water from any spring or underground source. He'd unleashed something, broken something that was never meant to be broken. The dreams came back to him, the people tending the trees, protecting them. They hadn't been honoring the trees. They'd been maintaining them, keeping them intact for a reason. He looked toward Timber Ridge. The town was 2 miles away, mostly downhill from here. If this substance kept spreading, it would reach the town by afternoon, maybe sooner. He had to warn them. He had no idea what this crystalline water would do, but he knew with absolute certainty that it was dangerous. Ezra grabbed his axe and started running. He was 58 and hadn't run anywhere in years, but fear gave him speed. He crashed through the underbrush, following the game trail he knew would take him fastest to the road. Behind him, the humming grew louder, and he could swear he heard the sound of water flowing, spreading, consuming the forest floor. He burst out onto the dirt road that led to Timber Ridge and kept running. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't slow down. The town appeared ahead, its wooden buildings looking small and fragile against the vast landscape. A few people moved along the main street, going about their morning business, unaware that something impossible was heading their way. Ezra stumbled into town, gasping for breath. Several people turned to stare at him. He never came to town at a run, never showed this kind of urgency. Sheriff Crane stepped out of her office, hand instinctively going to the pistol at her hip when she saw his face. Ezra, what's wrong? He bent over, hands on his knees, trying to get enough air to speak. The tree, he managed. I cut down the tree. Something's coming. Something's wrong. More people gathered around him. Doc Holloway pushed through the small crowd. Slow down, Ezra. Catch your breath and tell us what happened. Ezra straightened, looking back toward the mountains. The cottonwood that was leaking water. I cut it down this morning. The water changed. It turned into something else, spreading across the ground. It's heading this way. I don't know what it is, but we need to... He stopped. At the edge of town, where the road came down from the mountains, something glittered in the sunlight. The crystalline substance had moved faster than he'd thought possible. It flowed down the road like a living thing, spreading to either side, covering everything in its path with that strange, translucent sheen. The crowd turned to look. Someone gasped. The substance reached the first building, the old stable at the town's edge, and began climbing the wooden walls. It reached the town limits and stopped. Just stopped, as if hitting an invisible barrier. It spread sideways, following the perimeter of the town, but came no closer to the buildings or the people standing in the street. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. They stood frozen, staring at the impossible thing that surrounded their town like a crystalline moat. Then Timothy Walsh, standing near the front of the crowd, took a step toward it. "Don't!" Ezra shouted, but the young man had already reached out his hand. His fingers touched the surface of the crystalline substance. Timothy went rigid, his whole body locked in place, hands still extended, eyes wide and staring at something no one else could see. He made no sound, didn't fall, just stood there like a statue, completely motionless. Doc Holloway rushed forward and grabbed Timothy's shoulder, trying to pull him back. The moment the doctor touched the young man, he froze too, his face locked in an expression of shock and wonder. Sheriff Crane grabbed Ezra's arm. "What in God's name did you unleash?" Ezra could only shake his head, staring at the two frozen men, at the crystalline barrier surrounding Timber Ridge, at the destruction he'd caused with a single decision to cut down a tree. He'd lived alone for 12 years to avoid hurting anyone else the way he'd been hurt when Sarah died. But isolation hadn't protected anyone. His choice had put the entire town in danger, and somewhere in the mountains, 6 more trees wept water onto the ground, each one a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. The locket had been in Ezra's pocket for 12 years. He'd carried it every day since Sarah's death, a small silver oval that contained a pressed wildflower, a forget-me-not she'd picked on one of their walks, and a photograph of her taken the summer before she died. The metal was worn from his habit of touching it in moments of stress or sadness, running his thumb over the engraved pattern on its surface. It was his reminder of what he'd lost, and why he'd chosen solitude over the risk of losing anyone else. Now, standing in the main street of Timber Ridge, with two men frozen like statues and a crystalline barrier surrounding the town, he found himself reaching for that locket again. The cool metal against his palm steadied him slightly, though nothing could ease the crushing guilt that pressed down on his chest. Sheriff Crane took charge immediately. Everyone back away from that barrier. Don't touch it, don't go near it. Get inside the buildings now. Her voice carried authority that came from years of keeping order in a rough town. People obeyed, though they kept looking back at Timothy and Doc Holloway, standing motionless at the barrier's edge. Within an hour, the entire population of Timber Ridge had gathered in the church, the largest building in town. 347 people, minus the two who stood frozen outside. Conversations filled the space, dozens of voices asking questions no one could answer, proposing theories that ranged from reasonable to wild. Jacob Mercer stood near the front, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to being listened to. He owned the largest ranch in the area, or had until the drought started killing his cattle. "This is what happens when a man meddles with things he doesn't understand," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Ezra Blackwood cut down that tree without thinking about consequences, and now look where we are." Ezra stood against the back wall, feeling every eye turn toward him. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd had no way of knowing what would happen. But Mercer was right. He'd acted without understanding, and people were suffering for it. Sheriff Crane stepped to the front of the church. "Blaming Ezra doesn't help us now. We need to figure out what we're dealing with and how to fix it. Doc Holloway and Timothy are still alive. We can see them breathing, see them standing. Whatever this is, it hasn't killed them. Yet," someone called from the crowd. "We need information," the sheriff continued. "Has anyone seen anything like this before? Read about it? Heard stories?" Silence. Then a young woman near the front spoke up. Elena Vasquez was the schoolteacher relatively new to Timber Ridge, having arrived about 3 years ago from somewhere in the southwest. "My grandmother used to tell stories," she said quietly, "about guardian trees in the old forests. She said they were sacred, that they protected something important. I never knew if the stories were real or just folklore." Every head turned toward her. "What else did she say?" Sheriff Crane asked. "That the trees were never supposed to be cut down, that they were tended by people who understood their purpose. But that was generations ago. The knowledge was lost." Eleanor looked uncomfortable with the attention. "I thought they were just stories she told to teach respect for nature." Timothy's voice had mentioned something similar just last week. Ezra remembered the young man asking questions about the weeping tree, saying he'd heard old legends about such things. At the time, Ezra had dismissed it as the kind of romantic notions young people held about the wilderness. Sheriff Crane made a decision. "Elena, Ezra, come with me. We're going to the town archive. If there are any records, any mentions of these trees or anything unusual about this area, we need to find them." She pointed to two men in the crowd. "You two, keep watch on Doc and Timothy. Note any changes, no matter how small. Everyone else, stay calm and stay inside. We'll figure this out." The town archive was a small room in the back of the general store where old documents were kept in crates and filing cabinets. The founder of Timber Ridge, a man named Josiah Crane, the sheriff's great-grandfather, had been meticulous about record-keeping. Letters, journals, land surveys, and town meeting minutes dating back to 1847 were stored here. Though few people had any reason to look at them, Ezra, Elena, and Sheriff Crane began searching through the documents. Dust filled the air as they opened boxes that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The silence was broken only by the rustle of old paper and the occasional comment about what they'd found. It was Ezra who discovered the journal. Leather-bound, its pages yellowed and brittle, it was tucked in a wooden box labeled J. Crane, Personal. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was elegant but faded, dated entries beginning in March 1847. He read aloud. "We have established our settlement in the valley below the mountains. The land is rich, water plentiful, and the forest abundant. The native people we encountered spoke of trees in these mountains that must not be disturbed. They called them the Weeping Sentinels, said they were placed here by the ancients to guard the sacred springs." Sheriff Crane leaned over his shoulder. "That's my great-grandfather's writing." "Keep reading," Ezra turned the page. "I paid little attention to these warnings at first, dismissing them as superstition. But I have seen these trees myself now. 7 of them scattered throughout the mountains, each one ancient beyond measure, each one weeping water from their trunks. The native elder who spoke with me was insistent. These trees must be protected. He said they filter the water from deep springs, that without them the water becomes dangerous. I did not fully understand, but I gave my word that we would not disturb them." "Filter the water," Elena repeated. "From what?" "To make it safe for what?" Ezra continued reading, flipping through pages that detailed the early days of the settlement. Most entries were mundane: weather reports, crop yields, disputes between settlers. Then, dated August 1851, he found another relevant passage. A prospector named Harrison attempted to cut down one of the Weeping Sentinels, believing there might be gold or minerals in the water it produced. I stopped him before he could complete the task, but the damage was done. The tree bled water for 3 days, and where the water touched the ground, it crystallized into a substance that trapped several of our cattle. The animals stood frozen, unable to move, for nearly a week before the effect wore off. Harrison left town in shame. I've warned all settlers to leave these trees untouched. Some knowledge is beyond our understanding, and some warnings should be heeded even when we cannot explain them." The 3 of them looked at each other. The pattern was clear: cut the tree, water becomes crystalline, things freeze in place. But that didn't explain why or how to reverse it. "The effect wore off," Sheriff Crane said. "After a week, the cattle recovered. Maybe Timothy and Doc will be fine if we just wait." "Maybe," Ezra said, though he wasn't convinced. "But the journal says Harrison didn't complete the task. He only damaged the tree. I cut mine down completely, and that barrier outside isn't going away. If anything, it seems to be getting stronger." Elena was searching through other boxes. She pulled out a map, hand-drawn and carefully labeled. "Look at this. It shows the locations of all 7 trees Josiah mentioned. Your tree was here." She pointed to a mark on the map. "And there are 6 others scattered throughout the range." Ezra studied the map. One of the other marked locations was familiar. He'd passed by that area just 2 weeks ago. There'd been a massive cottonwood there, and now that he thought about it, it had looked sickly. Brown leaves, cracking bark. "This one," he pointed. "I think it's dying." The implications settled over them like a weight. One tree cut down had trapped a town. One tree dying might do the same or worse. And they had no idea how to stop it or reverse the damage already done. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of the men who'd been watching Timothy and Doc Holloway stuck his head in. "Sheriff, you need to see this. They're moving." The Founder's Journal lay open on the table as they rushed out of the archive. Ezra grabbed it, unwilling to leave behind what might be their only guide to understanding what was happening. The leather binding was soft with age, the pages fragile, but Josiah Crane's words were the closest thing they had to a map through this crisis. Outside, Timothy and Doc Holloway were no longer frozen in place. They stood near the barrier, moving slowly, like men waking from a deep sleep. Their eyes were open but distant, unfocused. As Ezra and the others approached, Timothy blinked and turned his head. "I saw it," he said, his voice hoarse. "I saw everything." Doc Holloway nodded slowly. "The land, the water, the people who came before." He looked at his hands as if surprised to find them moving again. "How long were we standing there?" "About 2 hours," Sheriff Crane said. "What did you see?" Timothy sat down heavily on the ground, still looking shaken. "When I touched the barrier, it was like falling into a river of memories. Not my memories, older ones. I saw this valley before the town existed, saw people living here who knew these mountains better than we ever could. They understood the trees, the water. They knew what it was and why it mattered. What was it? Elena asked, kneeling beside him. The water comes from deep in the earth, Timothy said. From springs that have been there since before people walked this land. The water carries minerals, elements from deep underground. In its pure form, it's powerful, too powerful. It affects living things, freezes them in place, traps them in time. The trees evolved to filter it, to process those minerals, and make the water safe. Doc Holloway continued the explanation. The trees are like lungs for the earth, breathing in the dangerous water and breathing out something clean. They've been doing it for thousands of years. Cut one down, and the unfiltered water escapes. That crystalline substance, that's the water in its raw form, before the trees process it. Ezra felt the weight of understanding settle on him. He hadn't just cut down a tree. He'd destroyed a natural system that had been protecting this valley for longer than recorded history. The dying tree, he said. If it fails naturally, the same thing will happen. Worse, Timothy said. I saw that too in the visions. If enough trees fail, if too many of them are cut down or die, the effect spreads. The underground water system is all connected. It flows beneath the mountains, feeding all 7 trees. Lose too many, and the whole system fails. Sheriff Crane crossed her arms, processing this information. So we need to protect the remaining trees and figure out how to fix the damage you've already done to the one you cut. The stump, Ezra said suddenly. We need to go back to the stump. If the tree was filtering the water, maybe the roots are still alive, still trying to do their job. Maybe there's a way to help them, to close off the flow. Elena stood. In my grandmother's stories, there were rituals. Ways to tend the trees, to heal them if they were damaged. She said the knowledge was passed down through families, but it died out when the last keeper passed away. That would have been in the 1940s. Did she teach you any of it? Sheriff Crane asked. Fragments, pieces. She tried, but I was young and didn't understand the importance. I thought they were just pretty stories. Elena's face showed regret. I remember something about herbs, about speaking to the trees in a certain way, about working with the moon phases. Timothy pulled himself to his feet. We need to go back to the stump. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we can fix it. The 4 of them made their way out of town, skirting the crystalline barrier that still surrounded Timber Ridge. The substance hadn't spread beyond the town's boundaries, but it showed no signs of fading either. It created a shimmering wall between the town and the forest, beautiful and terrible at the same time. The walk to the fallen cottonwood took them through familiar forest, but Ezra saw it differently now. Every tree took on new significance. Were they part of this system too, in some smaller way? Did the entire forest depend on those 7 ancient guardians? When they reached the clearing, the devastation looked worse than Ezra remembered. The massive cottonwood lay where it had fallen, its branches broken, its trunk split in places from the impact. The stump rose from the ground like a monument to his mistake. Water still flowed from it, but slower now, and the crystalline substance covered the ground for 50 feet in all directions. Timothy approached the stump carefully, avoiding the crystalline layer. He knelt at the edge and examined the wood. Look at this, he said. The stump is hollow. There's a cavity inside, like the whole center of the tree was empty. They gathered around, peering into the stump. The hollow went deep, farther down than seemed possible. Ezra could see roots extending down into darkness, and beyond that, the glint of water reflecting what little light penetrated the opening. There's a chamber down there, Doc Holloway said. Under the tree, the water is coming from below, flowing up through the roots. Ezra studied the inside of the hollow. Strange markings covered the inner surface of the wood, patterns that looked almost like writing, though in no language he recognized. The marks were old, carved into the living wood so long ago that the tree had grown around them, incorporating them into its structure. Someone made this, Elena said, tracing one of the patterns with her finger without touching it. This isn't natural. The tree was cultivated, shaped over time to do this specific job. Timothy pointed down into the hollow. We need to go down there. Whatever system exists to filter the water, it's below ground. That's where we'll find answers." The four of them looked at each other. Going down into an unknown chamber beneath a tree that leaked mysterious water seemed dangerous at best, suicidal at worst. But Timber Ridge was surrounded by a crystalline barrier. 2 people had already been frozen for hours, and another tree was dying somewhere in these mountains. They didn't have the luxury of caution. They needed answers, and those answers were waiting in the darkness below the stump. The stone markers were the first thing Ezra saw when they descended into the chamber. Carved from granite, each stone stood about 3 feet tall and was positioned at regular intervals around the underground space. The markings on them matched the patterns inside the tree stump, angular symbols that might have been writing or might have been something else entirely, some form of communication that went beyond language. They'd fashioned a rope from spare line Timothy had brought and used it to lower themselves one at a time into the hollow. The chamber was larger than it had appeared from above, a natural cave that had been modified and expanded over time. The ceiling was perhaps 15 feet high, supported by the massive roots of the fallen cottonwood. Those roots were as thick as a man's body, spreading across the ceiling and walls like the veins of some enormous living thing. Water pooled in the center of the chamber, fed by a spring that bubbled up from somewhere deeper still. The water was clear, but had that strange quality Ezra had noticed before. It seemed to shimmer with an inner light, catching and reflecting illumination that shouldn't exist in this dark place. The spring was the source of everything. The weeping tree, the crystalline barrier, the visions that had trapped Timothy and Doc Holloway. Elena moved from marker to marker, studying the symbols. "These are boundary stones," she said. "My grandmother had drawings of stones like these. They mark sacred spaces, places where the earth's power is concentrated." She knelt beside one, careful not to touch it. "Each stone is positioned precisely. They form a pattern, a circle that contains the spring. The water is different inside the circle," Doc Holloway observed. He'd been studying the spring itself. "Look at how it flows. Inside the circle it's calm, controlled, but if you look at where it seeps past the markers, it becomes agitated, unstable." Timothy was examining the roots overhead. The tree's roots grow along the stones, following the pattern. It's like the tree and the stones were working together to contain the spring, to process the water before it reached the surface. Ezra stood in the center of the chamber, trying to understand the system he'd inadvertently destroyed. The ancient people who'd created this had understood something fundamental about the water, about its power and danger. They'd built a living filter, combining natural growth with carved stone and careful placement to create something that could last for thousands of years. And he'd taken an axe to it without a second thought. "We need to map all of this," Sheriff Crane said. She'd brought paper and pencil and was already sketching the layout of the chamber. "If there are 6 more trees, there are probably 6 more chambers like this. We need to understand the system as a whole." They spent the next hour documenting everything they could see. Elena copied the symbols from the stones, trying to capture every detail. Timothy measured the distances between markers and the dimensions of the chamber. Doc Holloway collected a sample of the spring water in a glass vial, sealing it carefully. Ezra examined the roots, noting how they'd been trained or encouraged to grow in specific patterns. When they climbed back to the surface, the sun was past its peak. The walk back to town was quiet, each of them processing what they'd seen. The crystalline barrier still surrounded Timber Ridge, unchanged. As they approached, they could see people watching from windows, waiting for news. But before they reached the town, they encountered Jacob Mercer and a group of men on horseback. Mercer's face was set in hard lines, and the men with him carried axes and saws. A dozen of them, all armed with logging tools. Sheriff Crane stepped into their path. "Where do you think you're going with those?" "To solve this problem the only way that makes sense," Mercer said. "Those trees are the source of the trouble. We cut them all down, drain the water, and this ends." "You can't," Timothy said, stepping forward. "That will make everything worse. The trees are protecting us, filtering the water. Destroy them, and the raw water spreads everywhere." Mercer's expression didn't change. The way I see it, one tree caused this mess. Getting rid of the rest eliminates the threat. It's simple mathematics. It's not simple, Elena said. The underground water system connects all 7 trees. Cutting them down won't drain anything. It will just release all that dangerous water at once. It could spread across the entire region. And I'm supposed to take the word of a school teacher and a blacksmith's apprentice over my own experience. Mercer shook his head. I've ranched this land for 30 years. I know how to solve problems. You remove the source, the problem goes away. Ezra understood Mercer's thinking because it mirrored his own from that morning. Practical, direct, simple. It was the kind of solution that made sense when you didn't know what you were dealing with. I thought the same thing, he said quietly. That's why we're in this situation. The tree wasn't the problem, it was the solution. We just didn't understand it. So what? We leave them standing and hope for the best. Mercer gestured toward town. That barrier has been there for 6 hours. It's not getting weaker, it's getting stronger. I saw it earlier. It's grown 3 inches higher since this morning. Meanwhile, we're trapped. Can't get supplies in or out. Can't reach our ranches or farms. How long do you expect people to wait while you study old stones and read journals? Sheriff Crane's hand rested on her pistol. Jacob, I understand you're scared. We all are. But charging off to cut down more trees without understanding what you're doing is exactly how we got into this mess. Give us time to figure this out properly. Time. Mercer's voice dripped with contempt. Time for what? For more people to get frozen when they touch that barrier. For the whole town to starve when our food runs out? I've got 50 head of cattle that need tending, and I can't reach them. Every day we wait costs me money I can't afford to lose. One of the men behind Mercer spoke up. The drought already killed half my herd. I can't afford to lose the rest because we're too scared to take action. Ezra saw the fear behind their anger. These were men whose livelihoods were failing, who'd watched the drought destroy their work, and who now faced a threat they couldn't fight with tools or strength. They needed something to do, some action to take, even if it was the wrong action. 3 days, Ezra said. You give us 3 days to find a solution. If we can't fix this by then, I'll help you cut down the trees myself. Sheriff Crane shot him a sharp look, but he met her eyes steadily. He understood men like Mercer because he'd been one of them his whole life. They needed a deadline, a concrete promise, something to hold on to. Mercer considered this. 3 days. But if that barrier is still standing on the 4th day, we're taking down every tree in these mountains. And Ezra, you're coming with us whether you like it or not. You started this. You'll help finish it. The group rode off, leaving the 4 of them standing in the road. Sheriff Crane turned on Ezra. 3 days? What made you think we can solve this in 3 days? Because we have to, Ezra said simply. You saw those men. They're desperate. Desperate people do desperate things. If we can't give them hope, they'll take action on their own. Back in town, the tension was palpable. The barrier had indeed grown, exactly as Mercer had said. It now stood about 7 feet high, a shimmering wall that completely enclosed Timber Ridge. People had tried throwing things over it. Nothing passed through. They'd tried digging under it. The crystalline substance extended into the ground. They were truly trapped. A town meeting was called for that evening. Every resident crowded into the church again, and this time the fear was harder to hide. Food supplies would last maybe a week. Water from the wells was still clean, but no one knew if that would change. Children cried, sensing their parents' anxiety. Old folks sat quietly, having lived through enough hardships to know when a situation was truly dire. Elena stood at the front and explained what they'd discovered. She spoke clearly, using simple language, making sure everyone understood about the springs, the filtering system, the purpose of the trees. She told them about the visions, about the ancient people who'd built this system, about why cutting down more trees would be catastrophic. When she finished, an elderly woman in the back row raised her hand. My grandmother told me stories about her grandmother, would have been my great-great-grandmother. Said she was one of the water keepers, last of her line. Always said the knowledge would be needed again someday, but she died before teaching anyone properly. Did she leave anything behind? Elena asked. Any writings, any tools? There's a bag of hers up in my attic, herbs and such. I never knew what they were for, kept them because they were hers. The old woman stood. I'll fetch it. Hope, fragile as spring ice, settled over the room. Maybe they weren't as lost as they'd feared. Maybe the knowledge wasn't entirely gone. Maybe, with 3 days and the fragments of old wisdom, they could find a way to close what Ezra had opened, to heal what he had broken. But first, they needed to find that dying tree. The medicine bag was made of deer skin, soft with age and use. Inside were bundles of dried herbs wrapped in cloth, small carved stones, a length of braided cord, and a notebook filled with cramped handwriting in faded ink. Elena's hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing immediately that this was exactly what they needed. The old woman who'd brought it, her name was Margaret Holloway. Doc's mother sat beside Eleanor as they examined the contents. My great-great-grandmother was called Anna. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. The knowledge went back generations, all the way to the people who first tended these trees. Elena read aloud from the notebook. The trees breathe for the earth, taking in what is dangerous and releasing what is safe. To close a tree that has been opened, one must speak to the roots in the old language, offer the sacred herbs, and work with the moon's blessing. The closing must be done with respect and understanding, or the tree will not respond. Do you know the old language? Timothy asked some of it. My grandmother taught me phrases, songs. I never understood their purpose, but I remember them. Elena looked up from the notebook. This describes a ritual, step by step. It requires specific herbs at specific times, and it must be done at night, under a waning moon. Sheriff Crane checked the calendar hanging on her office wall. The moon is 2 days past full. It's waning now. We could attempt the ritual tomorrow night, but there's more. Elena continued reading. Before the closing can succeed, one must understand why the tree was opened. The ritual requires intention, not just action. The person who harmed the tree must be the one to heal it, and they must do so with full knowledge of what they're repairing. All eyes turned to Ezra. He'd known on some level that this would fall to him. The guilt had been eating at him since the moment the tree fell. Now he had a chance to make it right, but the responsibility felt heavier than any burden he'd carried before. I'll do it, he said. Whatever needs to be done. Doc Holloway leaned forward. The ritual is dangerous, according to these notes. The person performing it must touch the spring water directly, must allow it to show them the truth of what they've done. It's similar to what happened to Timothy and me, but deeper, more intense. You'll see not just memories, but consequences. The weight of your action and all its ripples through time. I can handle it, Ezra said. Though he wasn't sure that was true, Eleanor spent the rest of the evening studying the notebook, copying key passages and trying to decipher the parts written in the old language. Timothy helped her identify the herbs in the medicine bag, matching them to plants that grew in the surrounding mountains. Some they would need to gather fresh. Others were there in the bag, still potent despite their age. The ritual required sage, mountain laurel, and forget-me-nots. The sage and laurel could be found easily enough, but forget-me-nots were rare at this elevation and this time of year. Timothy remembered seeing some near a stream about 3 miles north, in a sheltered valley that stayed cool even in summer. I'll go at first light, he said. We need them fresh for the ritual to work. Sheriff Crane organized the practical matters. Food was rationed carefully. They had enough for 5 days if everyone was careful. Water was plentiful from the wells, and so far it remained clean. Guards were posted around the barrier to watch for changes and to keep people from touching it. The last thing they needed was more frozen townspeople. Jacob Mercer made a point of stopping by the church that evening. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. Heard you've got a plan, he said to Ezra. That true? A chance at one, Ezra replied. No guarantees. Mercer nodded slowly. I was wrong to blame you earlier. Well, not wrong, you did cause this. But I understand why you cut that tree. I'd have done the same in your position. Drought makes a man think about survival, makes him do what seems practical. He paused. My ranch is failing. Have been for months. Lost 60 head of cattle to the drought already. Couldn't afford to lose more, couldn't afford to wait around while the problem got worse. That's why I wanted to act. I understand, Ezra said, and he did. Fear and desperation made people take shortcuts, made them reach for simple solutions to complex problems. He'd done the same thing with the tree. I'll give you your 3 days, Mercer said. But Ezra, if this ritual doesn't work, we're going to have to try something else. Can't let the whole town starve because we're afraid of making things worse. After Mercer left, Ezra sat alone in the church, turning the locket over in his hands. He opened it, looked at Sarah's photograph. She'd been practical too, but she'd also been patient. She would have taken time to understand before acting. She would have asked questions, sought advice, thought through consequences. She wouldn't have grabbed an axe and rushed into a decision. He'd been running from her memory for 12 years, but maybe what he needed was to run toward it. To remember not just the loss, but the lessons. Sarah had made him better, more thoughtful, more connected to the world around him. In leaving society after her death, he'd abandoned those parts of himself too. The ritual tomorrow night would require him to face what he'd done with full awareness. Part of him dreaded that. The guilt was already crushing. But another part, the part that still remembered the man he'd been when Sarah was alive, knew that facing consequences was necessary. You couldn't heal what you refused to acknowledge. Elena found him there an hour later. She sat beside him in the pew, not speaking at first. Finally, she said, "My grandmother used to say that the earth forgives us when we make mistakes, as long as we try to make them right. She said that's what the trees teach us, how to take in what's harmful and transform it into something good." I hope she was right. Ezra said, "The ritual will work," Elena said with more confidence than he felt. "Not because the herbs are magical or the words are powerful, but because you understand now what you didn't understand before. That's what the trees respond to: understanding, respect, intention. You'll close what you opened because you finally see why it should never have been opened at all." They sat together in the quiet church, two people carrying the weight of old knowledge and new responsibility, hoping that tomorrow night would bring redemption rather than further disaster. Timothy left before dawn to search for the forget-me-nots. He took the rifle and a pack with food and water, expecting to be gone most of the day. The valley he remembered was 3 miles north, but the terrain was rough and the flowers might be difficult to find. Elena gave him careful instructions about how to harvest them properly, with respect, with intention, taking only what was needed. While Timothy was gone, Ezra and Elena returned to the fallen cottonwood. They needed to prepare the site for the ritual, to understand exactly what they'd be working with when night came. The morning was already hot, promising another scorching day. The drought showed no signs of breaking. The crystalline substance around the stump had hardened overnight, becoming more solid, more permanent-looking. Ezra knelt beside it and studied the way it had formed. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, radiating out from the stump in geometric lines that suggested some kind of underlying structure. "It's following the roots," Elena observed. "Look how it branches. It's tracing the path of the root system underground." She was right. The crystalline lines matched exactly where Ezra knew the major roots had spread. The tree, even in death, was still trying to do its job, still trying to contain and process the water that flowed from the spring below. But without the living wood, without the filtering system that had taken thousands of years to develop, it was failing. They climbed down into the chamber again, this time bringing lanterns to see better. In the improved light, Ezra noticed things he'd missed before. More markings on the walls, not just on the stones. Carved into the living rock were diagrams, maps, he realized. Detailed maps showing not just the 7 trees in this area, but hundreds of others spreading across what he recognized as the western half of North America. "There are more," Elena breathed, tracing the marks with her finger. So many more. Each tree was marked with the same symbol that appeared on the boundary stones. Lines connected them, showing the underground water systems that linked them all together. It was vast, far larger than either of them had imagined. This wasn't just a local system protecting one valley. It was continental in scale. They found more documents in a niche carved into the wall, papers protected from moisture in sealed clay jars. The papers were old, but preserved, covered in writing in multiple languages. Elena recognized Spanish, English, and what might have been French. There were also languages neither of them knew, angular scripts that might have been indigenous or might have been something older. Ezra carefully unfolded one of the English documents. It was dated 1847 and signed by Josiah Crane. I have compiled what knowledge I could gather from the native peoples, the Spanish missionaries, and my own observations. The trees are not native to this land, in the way we understand native species. They were brought here or perhaps cultivated here by people who lived thousands of years before any European set foot on this continent. He read further, his hands starting to shake. These trees serve a vital purpose. The water that flows from the deep springs carries minerals from the Earth's core, elements that should not reach the surface in concentrated form. In its raw state, this water has the power to freeze time itself, to trap living things in a state between life and death. The trees filter these minerals, breaking them down through their living processes, releasing clean water that sustains rather than traps. Elena picked up another document, this one in Spanish. She translated slowly. It speaks of the Great Freezing, an event that nearly destroyed the people who lived here long ago. Many trees died in a plague, and when they fell, the raw water spread across the land. Entire villages were frozen. Animals, plants, everything that the water touched became trapped. It took generations for the survivors to cultivate new trees, to restore the balance. They vowed that the knowledge of the trees would be preserved forever, that no one would ever again carelessly destroy what protects all life. They looked at each other, the full weight of what they were reading settling on them. This wasn't just about Timber Ridge. The tree Ezra had cut down was part of a network protecting the entire continent. If enough trees failed, if the system collapsed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Ezra found another document, this one dated 1923 and written in English by someone named Catherine Ortiz. I am the last keeper trained in the old ways. My mother taught me, and her mother before her, but the knowledge is dying. Young people move to cities, and the old traditions seem like superstitions to them. I have tried to pass on what I know, but no one listens. When I am gone, the trees will be unprotected. I pray that they remain strong enough to survive without human care, but I fear for the day when ignorance destroys what wisdom built. This is what happened, Eleanor said quietly. The knowledge died out. People forgot why the trees mattered. And now we're here, trying to piece together what was lost. Ezra continued exploring the chamber. At the far end, partially hidden behind a fallen stone, he found a cavity in the wall. Inside was something that made his breath catch, a book bound in leather and metal, protected from moisture by a sealed case of what looked like glass or crystal. He carefully removed it and brought it into the light. The book was a manual, written in multiple languages with detailed illustrations. It showed the proper way to tend the trees, how to perform rituals for healing damaged ones, how to cultivate new trees if needed, and most importantly, what would happen if the system failed. Elena turned to the final section, and what she read made her go pale. If more than 30% of the trees fail, the underground water systems will become unstable. The pressure from the deep springs will increase, forcing raw water to the surface at every remaining tree. If more than 50% fail, the system will collapse entirely. The Great Freezing will return, spreading across the continent in a wave that could take decades to recede. Ezra did the mathematics in his head. The map showed approximately 400 trees across the western half of the continent. 30% was 120 trees. How many had already failed? How many had been cut down by people who didn't know what they were doing? How close were they to the tipping point? We need to check on all 7 trees in this area, he said. Right now. If any others are failing, we need to know. They climbed out of the chamber and split up. Elena went to check the 3 trees north of Timber Ridge. Ezra took the 3 to the south. They agreed to meet back at town before sunset with whatever information they found. The first tree Ezra found was healthy, standing strong in a grove of aspens, water weeping gently from its trunk into a clear pool. The second was also intact, but the third, the one he'd noticed earlier that looked sickly, was in bad shape. The bark was cracking, large sections had fallen away, and the tree was leaning dangerously. It was dying, and when it finally fell, it would release its unfiltered water just as Ezra's tree had done. He marked the location carefully and hurried back toward town. He met Elena on the road. Her face told him what he needed to know before she spoke. "Two are fine," she said, "but the third is dead. It fell sometime in the last few days. There's a crystalline barrier around it, about 100 yards in diameter. It hasn't spread beyond that, but it's there, waiting. 7 trees in their area. 1 cut down by Ezra, 1 dead, 1 dying. That left 4 healthy trees out of 7. They'd already lost nearly 43% of the local system. If the dying tree fell, they'd be at 57%, past the critical threshold according to the manual. "The ritual tomorrow night," Ezra said. "If it works on my tree, can we use it on the others?" "According to the manual, yes. But we'd need to act fast. The dying tree might not last more than a few days, and we don't know about the hundreds of other trees across the continent. How many of them have already failed?" They walked back to Timber Ridge in silence, both understanding that they'd stumbled into something far larger than a local crisis. The barrier around their town was just a symptom. The real problem was continental in scale, and they had no way of knowing how close they were to catastrophe. When Timothy returned that evening with fresh forget-me-nots carefully wrapped in cloth, Ezra told him and Sheriff Crane what they'd discovered. The 4 of them stood in the church, looking at the drawings Elena had copied from the chamber, understanding that tomorrow night's ritual wasn't just about saving Timber Ridge. It was about preventing the Great Freezing from returning, about protecting a system that had kept an entire continent safe for thousands of years, about making right a mistake that could have consequences beyond anything Ezra had imagined when he'd raised his axe that morning. The weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. But there was no one else, no experts to call, no government agency that knew about this. Just 4 people in a small town, armed with fragments of old knowledge and a desperate hope that they could close what should never have been opened. The keeper's manual lay open on the table in Sheriff Crane's office. Elena had spent hours combining its instructions with the notes from the medicine bag and the information from Josiah Crane's journal. What emerged was a comprehensive guide, not perfect, but as complete as they could make it with the fragments they had. The ritual required precise timing and careful preparation. They would begin at moonrise, work through the night, and complete the closing just before dawn. Ezra would need to fast for the entire day beforehand to clear his mind and body. The herbs would be prepared in a specific order, burned in a specific pattern around the boundary stones in the chamber below the stump. But the most important element, according to every source they'd consulted, was intention. The person performing the ritual had to understand fully what they were repairing, had to accept responsibility for the damage they'd caused, and had to approach the task with genuine humility and respect. The trees, according to the old writings, could sense the difference between empty gestures and true understanding. "You'll need to speak to the spring," Eleanor explained, showing Ezra the phonetic transcriptions she'd made of the old language. These phrases asked permission to approach, acknowledge the harm that was done, and request the opportunity to make amends. They're not magic words that force the tree to respond. They're a way of showing respect, of demonstrating that you understand the relationship between humans and these guardians. Ezra practiced the phrases, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Elena corrected his pronunciation patiently, making him repeat each line until he could say it smoothly. The language felt ancient in his mouth, syllables that probably hadn't been spoken in this valley for generations. Timothy was preparing the physical elements of the ritual. The sage and mountain laurel had been bundled and dried slightly over the fire, just enough to help them burn cleanly. The forget-me-nots would be fresh, placed at specific points around the chamber. He'd also fashioned a simple compass from a magnetized needle and a piece of cork floating in water, not for finding direction, but for monitoring the trees. The manual had described how the trees' magnetic fields changed when they were healthy or distressed. Timothy hoped his device would let them track the other trees' conditions without having to visit each one physically. Sheriff Crane was managing the town. The barrier had grown another foot overnight, now standing 8 feet high and slowly closing over the top of the town like a dome. People were frightened, supplies were running low, and tensions were rising. Jacob Mercer and his men had been quiet so far, but she could see them gathering, talking in small groups, making plans of their own in case the ritual failed. She called a final town meeting that evening. Everyone gathered in the church once more, and she explained what would happen that night. She was honest about the risks, about what they'd discovered in the underground chamber, about the continental scale of the system they were dealing with. Some of you are thinking that if this ritual fails, we should cut down the remaining trees, she said. I understand that impulse, but I need you to hear this clearly. Cutting down more trees will not save us. It will doom us, and possibly doom every living thing in the western half of this continent. The barrier around our town is a warning, not a punishment. It's showing us what happens when these systems fail. An old farmer in the back stood up. So what are we supposed to do? Just hope this ritual works? Put all our faith in some old superstitions? Not superstition, Doc Holloway said, standing. Science we don't fully understand yet. I touched that barrier. I saw what it showed me. The water from those springs has properties that our current science can't explain, but that doesn't make them less real. The people who built this system understood something we forgot. We're just trying to remember, Elena added her voice. My grandmother told me that knowledge isn't just facts you learn from books. It's wisdom passed down through generations, tested by time, proven by survival. The people who tended these trees for thousands of years knew what they were doing. We're the ones who forgot, who thought we knew better. This ritual is our chance to reconnect with that older wisdom. A woman holding a small child spoke up. What happens if it doesn't work? What happens to us? Ezra stood, and the room fell silent. He hadn't spoken at a town gathering in 12 years. If the ritual fails, it's my responsibility to make this right in whatever way I can. But I believe it will work, not because I have faith in my own abilities, but because I finally understand what I did wrong. I acted without thinking, without respecting what I was destroying. The ritual is about more than just closing a wound in the earth. It's about acknowledging that wound, taking responsibility for it, and committing to do better. He looked around at the faces watching him. For 12 years I've lived alone on that mountain. I convinced myself I was protecting people by staying away, that I couldn't hurt anyone if I kept my distance. But isolation isn't protection. It's just another way of avoiding responsibility. These trees taught the people who tended them something important. We're all connected. What I do affects you. What you do affects the land. What happens to the land affects all of us. There's no separating ourselves from the consequences of our actions. The room was quiet. Then Timothy stood. I'll be with Ezra tonight, helping with the ritual. If anyone wants to help, we could use volunteers to maintain watch, to be ready in case something goes wrong. Hands went up across the room. More than Ezra had expected. People who'd been strangers to him. People he'd barely spoken to in all his trips to town. People who were willing to trust him with their lives because they had no other choice. Sheriff Crane organized them into shifts. Some would watch the barrier, tracking any changes. Others would stand guard around the fallen tree, ready to help if needed. A few volunteered to prepare food and supplies for afterward, hopeful that there would be an afterward. As the meeting dispersed, Jacob Mercer approached Ezra. The rancher's face was hard to read, but his voice was steady. I meant what I said about giving you 3 days. This is day 2. Tomorrow night, if that barrier is still standing, my men and I will take action. But tonight I'll be part of the watch. If your ritual works, I want to see it. If it fails, I want to be there to help figure out what comes next. It was as close to an apology as Ezra was likely to get, and he accepted it with a nod. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Ezra fasted as instructed, drinking only water from the town well. His stomach growled, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him focused, reminded him that some things required sacrifice and discipline. He spent the afternoon at Sarah's grave, telling her about everything that had happened, about the mistake he'd made and the chance he had to fix it. "I've been half alive since you died," he said to the simple wooden marker. "Going through motions, surviving but not really living. Maybe that's why I cut down that tree without thinking. I'd gotten used to not thinking, to not engaging with the world around me. But these people need me to be fully present now, to be the man I was when you were alive. The man who thought before acting, who considered consequences, who cared about more than just himself." As the sun set, Elena came to find him. Together they walked to the fallen cottonwood. Timothy was already there, having spent the day preparing the chamber below. He'd cleaned the space, arranged the boundary stones in their proper positions, and set up lanterns that would light their work through the night. Sheriff Crane arrived with a dozen townspeople who would maintain the watch. They spread out in a circle around the clearing, far enough back to be safe, but close enough to help if needed. Mercer was among them, rifle across his lap, watching everything with careful attention. The moon rose, waning but still bright enough to cast shadows. It was time Ezra climbed down into the chamber, followed by Elena and Timothy. The spring bubbled in the center, its strange luminescence the only light beyond their lanterns. The air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth. Ezra felt his heart pounding, his mouth dry despite the water all around him. Elena handed him the first bundle of sage. "We begin by purifying the space, acknowledging the damage that was done and asking permission to attempt healing." He took the sage, feeling its texture against his palm, and lit it from one of the lanterns. The smoke rose, acrid and sharp, filling the chamber. Following Elena's instructions, he walked the perimeter of the circle, formed by the boundary stones, letting the smoke drift over each one, speaking the words she'd taught him. The stones seemed to respond. Ezra couldn't explain it rationally, but he felt something shift in the chamber, as if the space itself was waking up, paying attention. The spring's bubbling grew louder, and the water's luminescence intensified. Timothy placed the forget-me-nots at the cardinal points around the spring, his hands careful and respectful. Elena began a low chant in the old language, words that had been used for this purpose for generations, beyond counting. Her voice echoed off the chamber walls, creating harmonics that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. Ezra moved to the spring. This was the moment he'd been dreading. According to the ritual, he would need to place his hands directly in the water to let it show him the full truth of what he'd done. It would be like what happened to Timothy and Doc Holloway, but deeper, more intense. He would see not just memories, but consequences, not just the past, but possible futures. He knelt at the water's edge. The surface was perfectly still, despite the bubbling source below, as if waiting for him. He could see his reflection in it, a face lined with age and regret, eyes that had seen too much loss and not enough hope. "I'm ready," he said. Though he wasn't sure that was true, Elena placed her hand on his shoulder. "Remember your intention. Remember why you're doing this. The water will test you, show you things that are hard to see. But if your intention is pure, if your understanding is real, it will also show you the way to heal what was broken." Ezra took a deep breath, thought of Sarah, thought of the town above them trapped behind a crystalline barrier, thought of the hundreds of trees across the continent, and the thousands of years of wisdom that had kept them standing. Then he plunged his hands into the spring. The ritual herbs were more than just plants. They were the key to communication, a bridge between human intention and the ancient intelligence of the trees. As Ezra's hands touched the spring water, the forget-me-nots, sage, and mountain laurel began to glow with a soft light, their essences releasing into the chamber air. The water was cold, shockingly so, and the moment his skin made contact, The world disappeared. Ezra found himself standing in the same chamber, but different. The stone was newer, the carvings fresh. People moved around him, speaking in that ancient language Elena had taught him fragments of. They tended the spring with careful hands, adjusting the boundary stones with precision. Singing to the tree roots that spread across the ceiling, he understood, in a way that transcended language, what they were doing. They were maintaining a balance, keeping the dangerous minerals in the deep water from reaching the surface in concentrations that could harm. The tree above was young, carefully cultivated, its roots trained to follow specific patterns that maximized its filtering capacity. The vision shifted. Years passed in moments. He saw generations of keepers tending the trees, passing knowledge from parent to child, maintaining a system that protected entire populations who never knew they were being protected. He saw droughts and floods, fires and winters. And through it all, the trees stood, weeping their gentle tears, filtering the dangerous water and releasing what was clean and safe. Then he saw the plague, a disease that swept through the trees, killing dozens, then hundreds. The keepers worked desperately to save what they could, but some trees were too far gone. As they died, raw water spread across the land. Villages froze. Animals became trapped in crystal. The survivors fled or adapted, learning to avoid the crystalline zones, waiting decades for the affected areas to slowly return to normal. The keepers cultivated new trees, a process that took generations. They developed better techniques, stronger varieties, more robust systems. They swore that the knowledge would be preserved forever, that no one would ever again carelessly destroy what protected all life. But the vision showed him what happened next. The knowledge faded. Keepers died without apprentices. The old languages disappeared. Written records were lost or forgotten. By the time Josiah Crane arrived in 1847, only fragments remained, preserved by a handful of families who half remembered the old ways but no longer fully understood their importance. Ezra saw his own century. He saw Catherine Ortiz, the last trained keeper, dying alone with her knowledge unshared. He saw the decades that followed, trees standing unprotected, some dying from disease or age or accident, each one releasing its burden of unfiltered water. Small zones of crystalline barrier appeared in remote areas, unexplained by science, dismissed as anomalies. And then he saw himself. He saw his own hands raising the axe, saw the blade bite into ancient wood, saw the tree fall and the water spread. But the vision didn't stop there. It showed him what could have happened if Timothy hadn't known the old legends, if Elena's grandmother hadn't preserved her knowledge, if the town hadn't come together. He saw the barrier spreading beyond Timber Ridge, consuming the valley, reaching other towns. He saw the dying tree fall and release more water. He saw the effect cascade, one tree's failure putting stress on the others, weakening them, causing more to fail. He saw the threshold crossed, more than half the trees gone, and then he saw the great freezing begin. It spread across the continent like a wave, slow but inexorable. Crystalline barriers appeared around every failed tree, growing and merging, creating zones where nothing could move or grow. Cities were cut off from farmland. Rivers were frozen mid-flow. Wildlife became trapped. The human cost was staggering, measured not in lives lost, but in lives suspended. People frozen in crystal for years or decades, aware but unable to move, unable to die. The vision showed him futures branching in different directions, based on different choices. In some, the ritual he was performing now succeeded. In others, it failed. In some, humanity learned from the crisis and restored the keeper tradition. In others, desperation led to more trees being cut, accelerating the catastrophe. But through all the possible futures, one thing remained constant: the trees themselves. They were not malicious or vengeful. They were simply doing what they had evolved or been bred to do: filter dangerous water and protect the surface world. They would continue trying to do that job, whether humans helped them or destroyed them, whether they succeeded or failed. Ezra felt the weight of every possible future pressing down on him. The guilt he'd been carrying since cutting down the tree multiplied 1,000-fold. But beneath the guilt, he felt something else, a fierce determination. He'd made one terrible choice in ignorance. Now he could make a better choice with understanding. The spring water showed him one more thing. The tree wasn't gone. The stump remained, and deep below the roots still lived. The filtering system was damaged, but not destroyed. If he could reconnect what had been severed, if he could help the roots remember their purpose, the tree could heal. Not back to what it was. That would take decades or centuries, but enough to close the flow of raw water, enough to dissolve the barrier around Timber Ridge. The vision released him. He gasped, pulling his hands from the water, his whole body shaking. Elena and Timothy caught him before he fell. The living root had survived when the rest of the tree fell. Ezra had seen it in the vision. A single major root that extended deeper than all the others, connecting directly to the spring source. That root was the key. If he could strengthen it, encourage it, help it remember its function, the filtering system could partially restore itself. The root, he gasped, still shaking from the vision's intensity. There's one main root that goes deeper. We need to find it, to work with it directly. Timothy understood immediately. He'd seen the chamber's structure, had traced where the root system spread. The back wall. There was a section where the roots were thicker, more concentrated. That must be it. They moved to the rear of the chamber, where the wall was covered in root growth. The roots here were as thick as Ezra's leg, ancient and strong. He placed his hand against them, and even through the bark he could feel a faint pulse, the flow of water moving through the living tissue. Elena consulted the keeper's manual by lantern light. The ritual requires blood, she said quietly. Not much, but it has to be freely given. The person who harmed the tree offers their own life force to help it heal. It's symbolic, but it's also practical. Human blood carries minerals that the roots can use. The ritual tomorrow night, Ezra said. If it works on my tree, can we use it on the others? According to the manual, yes. But we'd need to act fast. The dying tree might not last more than a few days. And we don't know about the hundreds of other trees across the continent. How many of them have already failed? They walked back to Timber Ridge in silence, both understanding that they'd stumbled into something far larger than a local crisis. The barrier around their town was just a symptom. The real problem was continental in scale, and they had no way of knowing how close they were to catastrophe. When Timothy returned that evening with fresh forget-me-nots carefully wrapped in cloth, Ezra told him and Sheriff Crane what they'd discovered. The four of them stood in the church, looking at the drawings Elena had copied from the chamber, understanding that tomorrow night's ritual wasn't just about saving Timber Ridge. It was about preventing the great freezing from returning, about protecting a system that had kept an entire continent safe for thousands of years, about making right a mistake that could have consequences beyond anything Ezra had imagined when he'd raised his axe that morning. The weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. But there was no one else, no experts to call, no government agency that knew about this. Just four people in a small town, armed with fragments of old knowledge and a desperate hope that they could close what should never have been opened. The keeper's manual lay open on the table in Sheriff Crane's office. Elena had spent hours combining its instructions with the notes from the medicine bag and the information from Josiah Crane's journal. What emerged was a comprehensive guide, not perfect, but as complete as they could make it with the fragments they had. The ritual required precise timing and careful preparation. They would begin at moonrise, work through the night, and complete the closing just before dawn. Ezra would need to fast for the entire day beforehand to clear his mind and body. The herbs would be prepared in a specific order, burned in a specific pattern around the boundary stones in the chamber below the stump. But the most important element, according to every source they'd consulted, was intention. The person performing the ritual had to understand fully what they were repairing, had to accept responsibility for the damage they'd caused, and had to approach the task with genuine humility and respect. The trees, according to the old writings, could sense the difference between empty gestures and true understanding. "You'll need to speak to the spring," Eleanor explained, showing Ezra the phonetic transcriptions she'd made of the old language. These phrases ask permission to approach, acknowledge the harm that was done, and request the opportunity to make amends. They're not magic words that force the tree to respond. They're a way of showing respect, of demonstrating that you understand the relationship between humans and these guardians. Ezra practiced the phrases, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Elena corrected his pronunciation patiently, making him repeat each line until he could say it smoothly. The language felt ancient in his mouth, syllables that probably hadn't been spoken in this valley for generations. Timothy was preparing the physical elements of the ritual. The sage and mountain laurel had been bundled and dried slightly over the fire, just enough to help them burn cleanly. The forget-me-nots would be fresh, placed at specific points around the chamber. He'd also fashioned a simple compass from a magnetized needle and a piece of cork floating in water, not for finding direction, but for monitoring the trees. The manual had described how the trees' magnetic fields changed when they were healthy or distressed. Timothy hoped his device would let them track the other trees' conditions without having to visit each one physically. Sheriff Crane was managing the town. The barrier had grown another foot overnight, now standing 8 feet high and slowly closing over the top of the town like a dome. People were frightened, supplies were running low, and tensions were rising. Jacob Mercer and his men had been quiet so far, but she could see them gathering, talking in small groups, making plans of their own in case the ritual failed. She called a final town meeting that evening. Everyone gathered in the church once more, and she explained what would happen that night. She was honest about the risks, about what they'd discovered in the underground chamber, about the continental scale of the system they were dealing with. "Some of you are thinking that if this ritual fails, we should cut down the remaining trees," she said. "I understand that impulse, but I need you to hear this clearly. Cutting down more trees will not save us. It will doom us, and possibly doom every living thing in the western half of this continent. The barrier around our town is a warning, not a punishment. It's showing us what happens when these systems fail." An old farmer in the back stood up. "So what are we supposed to do? Just hope this ritual works? Put all our faith in some old superstitions?" "Not superstition," Doc Holloway said, standing. "Science we don't fully understand yet. I touched that barrier. I saw what it showed me. The water from those springs has properties that our current science can't explain, but that doesn't make them less real. The people who built this system understood something we forgot. We're just trying to remember," Elena added her voice. "My grandmother told me that knowledge isn't just facts you learn from books. It's wisdom passed down through generations, tested by time, proven by survival. The people who tended these trees for thousands of years knew what they were doing. We're the ones who forgot, who thought we knew better. This ritual is our chance to reconnect with that older wisdom." A woman holding a small child spoke up. "What happens if it doesn't work? What happens to us?" Ezra stood, and the room fell silent. He hadn't spoken at a town gathering in 12 years. "If the ritual fails, it's my responsibility to make this right in whatever way I can. But I believe it will work, not because I have faith in my own abilities, but because I finally understand what I did wrong. I acted without thinking, without respecting what I was destroying. The ritual is about more than just closing a wound in the earth. It's about acknowledging that wound, taking responsibility for it, and committing to do better." He looked around at the faces watching him. "For 12 years I've lived alone on that mountain. I convinced myself I was protecting people by staying away, that I couldn't hurt anyone if I kept my distance. But isolation isn't protection. It's just another way of avoiding responsibility. These trees taught the people who tended them something important. We're all connected. What I do affects you. What you do affects the land. What happens to the land affects all of us. There's no separating ourselves from the consequences of our actions." The room was quiet. Then Timothy stood. "I'll be with Ezra tonight, helping with the ritual. If anyone wants to help, we could use volunteers to maintain watch, to be ready in case something goes wrong." Hands went up across the room. More than Ezra had expected. People who'd been strangers to him. People he'd barely spoken to in all his trips to town. People who were willing to trust him with their lives because they had no other choice. Sheriff Crane organized them into shifts. Some would watch the barrier, tracking any changes. Others would stand guard around the fallen tree, ready to help if needed. A few volunteered to prepare food and supplies for afterward, hopeful that there would be an afterward. As the meeting dispersed, Jacob Mercer approached Ezra. The rancher's face was hard to read, but his voice was steady. "I meant what I said about giving you 3 days. This is day 2. Tomorrow night, if that barrier is still standing, my men and I will take action. But tonight I'll be part of the watch. If your ritual works, I want to see it. If it fails, I want to be there to help figure out what comes next." It was as close to an apology as Ezra was likely to get, and he accepted it with a nod. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Ezra fasted as instructed, drinking only water from the town well. His stomach growled, but he welcomed the discomfort. It kept him focused, reminded him that some things required sacrifice and discipline. He spent the afternoon at Sarah's grave, telling her about everything that had happened, about the mistake he'd made and the chance he had to fix it. "I've been half alive since you died," he said to the simple wooden marker. "Going through motions, surviving but not really living. Maybe that's why I cut down that tree without thinking. I'd gotten used to not thinking, to not engaging with the world around me. But these people need me to be fully present now, to be the man I was when you were alive. The man who thought before acting, who considered consequences, who cared about more than just himself." As the sun set, Elena came to find him. Together they walked to the fallen cottonwood. Timothy was already there, having spent the day preparing the chamber below. He'd cleaned the space, arranged the boundary stones in their proper positions, and set up lanterns that would light their work through the night. Sheriff Crane arrived with a dozen townspeople who would maintain the watch. They spread out in a circle around the clearing, far enough back to be safe, but close enough to help if needed. Mercer was among them, rifle across his lap, watching everything with careful attention.